Hi, this is Brian Bieron with PlatformEconomyInsights.com, and today's briefing is my effort to give you some sense of what's going on in the context of U.S. and China relations, in the context of how the internet, and it's really not the internet, but how the internet, digital communications, operates in China, and how that is increasingly causing concerns in the context of U.S. government policy and Chinese firms who operate on the internet in China, how they are potentially going to impact the way things work on the internet in the United States and in other Western markets. It's a complicated and deep subject, hard to deal with in a video like this, but I think it's important to have a sense as to the kind of issues that are on the table. So first of all, I think it's important to remember that there's obviously a huge range of issues: economic, trade, security, technology, relating to the United States and China. Obviously it's 2019. There's been more than a year of really serious trade and tariff disagreements pushed by the administration over long-term policy issues regarding the way China runs their economy, engages in trade, deals with issues like investment and restrictions by investment in China. Some of these have been particularly focused on technology businesses. One set of those concerns has to do with intellectual property practices inside China. Another set of those concerns have more to do with the way that digital communications inside China is really seen by their government in a national security and law enforcement light. Obviously, there are huge differences between the way government and liberties, civil liberties, work in China and the United States. I'm not going to go too deep into that here. But the internet and communications inside China is something that the Chinese government has made clear for many, many years. They see in the context of their national security issues much more than really just economics. And so there's a tension there. By the way, there are other technology-related issues that are part of that national security or that security and law enforcement story inside China. Issues related to surveillance technology, issues related to artificial intelligence, the linkages to all those things, and something that you might want to look up called the Chinese Social Credit Score plan that they're putting together to, in their minds, promote better behavior by people, but some believe it really is the most striking kind of government surveillance linked in with benefits, carrots and sticks, benefits and punishments. There's so much going on. And those become technology issues, both because technology is at the heart of those tools, but also because the internet, or should I say the Chinese version of the internet, it is linked so closely with those government interests in China. Now, what's happening right now is, I think you need to learn what TikTok is. I guess if you have like teenagers at home, you might already know what TikTok is. If you haven't used it yourself, it is a video-based social media platform that is really popular around the world. And interestingly, TikTok itself is a service that is primarily popular outside of China. The parent company that owns TikTok is a company called ByteDance, and it has similar services that operate primarily inside China. Now, TikTok, while the parent company and its own home offices are inside China, it actually has most of its users outside China. For example, it has hundreds of millions of users in India. It also has tens of millions of active users in the United States. So it is really, without question, the number one Chinese owned and operated internet or social media app outside of China. Now, it has come into the limelight from a public policy perspective in recent months over two issues. The first being whether or not there was censorship going on the TikTok of the Chinese government. Now, there was a very interesting article that came out in the Washington Post a couple months ago, which noted, compared to other social media platforms, there was very little coverage or discussion of or user content that was visible regarding what was happening in Hong Kong, what is still happening in Hong Kong. And the thought was that potentially TikTok was actually censoring in some way user content to subvert, subjugate, block, otherwise moderate that kind of content. Now, shortly thereafter, there was some information that was leaked to the public that was early versions, and the company itself is not that old, but a couple-year-old content moderation guidelines from inside TikTok, which made it very clear that the company understood that having content moderated in a way that was aligned with what the Chinese government would like, it didn't need to be done by the Chinese government, but that it was aligned with what the Chinese government would like, was being pursued by the company. Now, so that's one issue, whether or not Chinese digital companies, such as TikTok, will moderate content or otherwise censor in a way that's aligned with Chinese government interests, because Chinese digital businesses need to have good relationships with the Chinese government to be able to operate. That's the way the economy works there when it comes to the internet and digital communications in particular. The second big topic to keep in mind, which is different than the censorship topic, is the potential for data on non-Chinese users being accessed or taken advantage of in some way by the Chinese government or Chinese government aligned interests. This is a data issue. Now, again, it most likely boils down to concerns over the fact that at the end of the day, Chinese digital companies must have very good and close relationships with the Chinese government and law enforcement, because that's the way the business works there. Now, so concerns have been raised with whether or not TikTok, with, again, at least tens of millions of active users in the US, that data would in some way be accessible by the Chinese government. Now, TikTok has denied that, just like they've denied the censorship claims. And I certainly don't, and I'm not sure anybody really knows what the right answer is. I think the concerns have more to do with what might be the case. The fact that it is understood that those relationships between Chinese government and law enforcement interests and digital firms need to be close, because if you don't have the okay from the Chinese government to operate, there is simply no operating inside China. So those two big issues have been raised recently by a number of members of Congress, leading members of the Senate and the House, essentially raising increased concerns over those two different topics, censorship and data access, in the context of TikTok. And I think it's important to recognize it goes beyond just that one company. So the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS. CFIUS is a interagency committee of U.S. government agencies and departments. It's led by the Department of Treasury, but it includes representatives from the security agencies, the Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, Department of Commerce. It's really a committee of different U.S. government agencies whose authority is to review acquisitions and investments made by foreigners in the United States for national security impacts. CFIUS has, in recent years, become more focused on Chinese digital investments related to U.S. firms and those non-American businesses and how they operate in the United States. Two examples in recent years was an effort by Ant Financial, who is a digital financial and payments business based in China, actually having similar ownership to Alibaba. So Ant Financial attempted to acquire MoneyGram, a US-based payments provider. Now, CFIUS ended up rejecting that acquisition. This was done in 2018, and it appears that the data implications of that acquisition were a key reason for the rejection. Now, that's a payments business, and it was the idea that this payments data would be likely shifted over and accessed inside China. That apparently caused a problem for CFIUS, and the acquisition was rejected. Potentially an even more similar situation than CFIUS looking at TikTok was the fact that CFIUS apparently reviewed the acquisition of the dating app Grindr by a Chinese technology company, Kunlun Tech. And it is reported, as opposed to rejecting the acquisition, after that acquisition occurred, it appears that CFIUS reviewed it, and again, the issues were about data access. Again, this is not the censorship issue that really brought TikTok's operations in the US to the fore. This was another data access issue. Apparently, CFIUS believed that the implications of data on millions of Americans potentially being accessed by Chinese authorities could be a problem. And they essentially, it's reported, told the Chinese company that they needed to sell the business back to an American investor. Now, those are two recent examples of CFIUS getting involved in this space of technology, digital communications, China and the US. Now, why is CFIUS able to look at what is happening with TikTok? Well, TikTok, which again has not been a big company with many users for a lot of years. It's a couple of years of major growth. One of the things that helped TikTok grow in the United States was the acquisition of another app, another social media app called Musical.ly. Now, interestingly, Musical.ly was founded by Chinese entrepreneurs. Now, like other Chinese digital businesses, it tends to create headquarters outside of China as well to show ownership outside of China. I suspect this has a lot to do with taxes. We won't get into it here, but it has to do with taxes and probably liability. So TikTok, owned by ByteDance, purchased Musical.ly, and Musical.ly had many users in the United States. And when that company was merged into TikTok, the Musical.ly app and its business was essentially folded right into TikTok, but it allowed TikTok to grow much bigger. CFIUS is looking at that acquisition. That was a 2017 acquisition. CFIUS, which has very broad authority, is now apparently opening an investigation of that acquisition to look at, most likely, the data implications. Now, this was a topic in a Senate Judiciary hearing just this past week, where TikTok and, interestingly, Apple were both invited to come testify. And actually, I think it's worth the third point of my discussion coming up here. And that is, why was Apple invited? And what does Apple have to do with TikTok? And the answer on that is basically nothing. Apple and TikTok are not related. But Apple is an example of a big American technology company that faces in its own way very similar issues as TikTok does. Apple has major business operations inside China. Many Apple devices are built in China or with parts that come from China. Apple sells a lot of product in China. Apple has services related to those products that it sells in China. China is a huge market for Apple. China is a huge market for lots of American businesses. And like how TikTok and other internet-related companies that operate in China need to have good relations with the Chinese government, because if you don't, you can't operate. I suspect Apple has many of those same concerns. Well, not unlike how the situation in Hong Kong led to greater scrutiny of how TikTok deals with content moderation and potential censorship, Apple in its own way has come under similar scrutiny. They've reportedly made some changes in how their apps operate and their app store in China that appeared to bend to the will of the Chinese government in terms of Hong Kong. Now, this is not a new thing for businesses dealing in China. You know, not only have many other businesses had to walk on sort of glass on Hong Kong, and the recent controversies related to the National Basketball Association, the NBA, and Hong Kong would be just one example that spent a lot of time in the news. But for many years, issues related to how companies deal with Taiwan, for example, and how they describe Taiwan. This is something that has been scrutinized by the Chinese government, and companies have known for a long time that they needed to be very careful if they wanted to operate effectively inside China. Because, again, operating in China as a successful business has a lot to do with whether or not the Chinese government lets you, especially when it has to do with digital communications or the Chinese version of the internet. So Apple was also scrutinized at that hearing. And Apple has been the recipient of very strong bipartisan letters from Capitol Hill essentially challenging how it's dealing with these very difficult issues related to communication and censorship and freedom when they deal with China, because of the issues, as I said, related to surveillance and artificial intelligence and the use of technology inside China to restrict various kinds of freedoms, religious, political, and the like. So there's a lot here. But what we're seeing related to TikTok is very likely to continue to play out, not just related to this one company, but the fact that at the end of the day, the way the internet operates in China is so different from outside China that the fact that we're likely to have more conflict is almost a natural. And if the U.S. government and U.S. policy officials are going to look at Chinese businesses who operate on the digital internet here in the United States, for example, as being fundamentally inconsistent with the way our internet operates when they also have to deal inside China with the Chinese government, then maybe we're going to see a greater divergence and almost a wall between being able to really operate as a major player in the United States and also be a major player or be a Chinese business. And that I suspect that honestly many people would look at that and say, well, the inverse has always been the case with China, because actually most U.S. digital and internet businesses have not been able to operate fully and openly at scale inside China with lots of Chinese users for exactly the similar kind of reasons that China is concerned about national security implications. So with that, this is Brian Bieron with PlatformEconomyInsights.com. I hope this provides a little more insight into why the U.S. government and policy officials are investigating TikTok and how it's actually an issue related to the broader differences between how the Chinese internet works, how the U.S. and Western internet operates, and raising questions about whether companies can really operate at scale at both places. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.